I'm John Travis in Novato, California on the 4th of May, 2020, talking to Scott Shannon in Fort Collins, Colorado. Good to meet you, Scott, after all these years.
Glad to meet you, Jack. As I was just saying, I've had when did the first draft of your book come out? Mid 80s?
81 was the trade version. We had a self-published three-ring binder version in 78 that sold a few thousand copies of that, but then 10 Speed Press picked it up. So we're going to talk about you today and what makes you tick, who you are and why, and what led you to do the great things you've done and are continuing to do, beginning with where you were born, where you grew up, and siblings, early childhood experiences that focused you on medicine, and take it away.
Well, let's see. I was born in upstate New York. My father and mother were born in Vermont. My dad went to UVM in Burlington, got a job with GE, and then his first posting was in Schenectady, New York, which is where I was born. And I was born into a large, generally happy Catholic, Irish Catholic family. Went to Catholic schools, and it's interesting to note that my dad was a comptroller and a finance guy, but I think he really wanted to be a physician. He worked as a corpsman when he was in the military between the Korean War and World War II, and he really loved that. And I think if he could have passed Spanish, he would have gone to medical school. You know, you had to have a language to be pre-med, at least whatever. He, like I, struggled with languages, so it wasn't a strong point. He also had my two older sisters while he was still in college, and my wife's mother lived with them, so he had a rather full house, and I think he had to get to work. But I grew up... What's that?
What number were you in the birth order?
I was the first male. My two older sisters, twins, are 6 years older. I had a younger sister, a year younger, a brother 3 years younger, who's a physician, and then another brother 13 years younger. And so I think there was, as Jung said, there's nothing more powerful in a parent's unfulfilled dreams. And I think the fact that my father wanted to be a physician was an influence on me. And I think my mother probably wanted me to be a priest, which is not uncommon for the firstborn male in an Irish Catholic family. And so I became a psychiatrist to please them both.
Good mix.
That's right. But I grew up mostly outdoors in rural upstate New York, in the fields and loving nature, and just sort of loving that. We moved to Phoenix when I was 12. And in Phoenix, I became interested in a variety of things. For a while in late middle school, I wanted to be, I would say growing up, I always wanted to be an architect. That came naturally. I loved designing things. And then somewhere around the age of 12 or 13, I got hooked on making movies, wanted to become a cinematographer. And I made all these elaborate movies through probably my junior year in high school. And I was convinced I wanted to be a cinematographer. I loved to create. And it took that sort of design and creative element to another level. And then in high school, I was helping a guy out with a psychology test first semester, and was reading him questions and looking over the textbook. And I said, wow, this is kind of interesting. And I really got interested in it. So I went to the teacher of the psychology class. It was a full year class, and said, boy, could I join this class second semester? I'm really interested in this. And he says, well, it is a 2-semester course, and they build on each other. So you'd need to be familiar with this material. Why don't you take a look at this textbook and take the first semester final, show me that you're serious. And if so, I'll let you in the class. Well, I did that, and I got one of the three highest scores on the test in the final. And then when I went to the teacher after the Christmas break, he refused to let me in. He said he changed his mind and that it wouldn't be a good idea and not a good precedent to set. So I went to the vice principal, and I went to a Jesuit all-boys school. So learning was quite serious. And he said, no, I'm going to back the teacher. This is his call. So I was really pissed off. So at that point, I decided I was going to learn this material anyways. I went and got a job at the local library and the Phoenix City Library. And I got to spend hours of time in the basements in the catalogs of the, and so I did that for about 6 months, just reading voraciously. And by the end of that time, I was convinced I wanted to be a psychiatrist. So I went to the University of Arizona and in Tucson. I was living in Phoenix at the time. And clear that I wanted to be a psychiatrist, so I signed up pre-med. And one of the first things I was exposed to was a class on alternative medicine, parapsychology. It was kind of a wide-ranging class.
In med school or pre-med?
This was undergrad.
Yeah.
I was a psychology major.
Still,
and I was
yeah.
in the honors program, and they had these honors thesis, which were these sort of free-ranging seminar or honors program, these free-ranging seminars, small groups, and allowed you to be very conversational, and as opposed to the 500 kids in my psychology 101 class. So at that point, I got curious about Edgar Cayce and holistic medicine and consciousness, and it just sort of deepened that. And I decided I wanted to do my thesis on consciousness. And so I went to my department advisor in psychology, who was a behavioralist and running rats in mazes. And he said, wow, this is really nothing I know anything about. He says, but there is a doctor out in the desert here by the name of Andrew Weil, who just moved here, and he might be a good advisor for your thesis. So he became an advisor, a mentor, then a friend. And I began.
Out in the desert?
He lived out in the desert. Tucson is a desert. So if you get much out of downtown, it's a desert. But he lived way out by Sabino Canyon at the time. So he began to advise me. I wrote my thesis, and that was what I was interested in. So I entered medical school there. That's when I heard about the American Holistic Medical Association. I joined that. I was very interested in consciousness. I began to explore psychedelics as a tool to understand consciousness. Somewhere near the end of my medical school training, I heard about MDMA and its use as an adjunct to psychotherapy. I became very curious about that. Around that time, I met my wife. I met her at my brother. My brother married her sister, so we met at their wedding in Tucson.
Wow. Huh.
And my brother was also in medical school at the time, and in kind of a unique circumstance, he was running D1 track while in medical school.
What's D1 track?
Division I track. So he was running in the Pac-10, Pac-12, Pac-10 as it was then, I think. But he got into medical school after 3 years and had missed 1 year of eligibility. So he had 2 years of eligibility to compete and ran the half mile for the University of Arizona while in medical school, a couple years behind me. But he got married in Tucson at our house. My wife, Sue, came with Lenny's mom, his fiance, and we met at the wedding and moved in soon after and got married a year later.
Wow.
Yeah, that was interesting. And I found medical school depressing, really disappointing on many levels. And I was really unconvinced that I wanted to stay in medicine because
where was the medical school? In
Tucson, University of Arizona.
Also in Tucson. Okay, I thought maybe it was Phoenix.
And Andrew Weil was an advisor, and there was some programming going on around, holistic stuff and integrative medicine, but still the actual rotations were just very disappointing, just sort of inhumane and not very psychologically or spiritually sophisticated and not very supportive, and you're overworked and demeaned and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking that I might want to teach psychobiology, and I applied at a couple Ivy League schools to teach psychobiology, got an interview at Colgate, and also decided I would look at one or two internships. And I looked in a Columbia program in Cooperstown in upstate New York. And I was sort of undecided. I got offered a position at Colgate. I got offered a position at Cooperstown. And I talked to my dad, and my dad said, if you go into teaching, you'll probably not be able to go back into medicine. But if you go into medicine, you could always jump into teaching. And I said, yeah, that's pretty reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up taking the internship. I did a psychiatric internship and really loved it. Had good mentors there, learned a lot. But really after a year, after this psychiatric internship where I had, I think, 6 months of psychiatry and then 6 months of, other things.
Rotating, yeah.
Emergency medicine, OB, peds, internal medicine. And at the end of that, I said, I just got to be done. I need to get out of training and I need to go do my own thing. So I had an arrangement with the state of Arizona where I'd go to a rural area and pay off some of my tuition. But they wanted primary care folks. They didn't want specialists. So I went to Florence, Casa Grande, Arizona, which is rural, hot Arizona, fairly poor, and just set up practice. I started to work with Gladys McGarry, who you may know of.
Yeah.
She was my mentor. The ARE clinic with Bill and Gladys was based in Scottsdale, but they were building a home an hour south of Phoenix in the Casa Grande area. And I contacted her to see what might be possible. And she said, we'd actually love to set up a clinic out here in rural Casa Grande. So I set up a clinic there, primary care clinic, and Gladys was sort of my mentor, although she was practicing 60 miles away most of the time. But her house was around the corner from our clinic. And it became clear that clinic was not going to have enough volume to keep me busy or paid. So I went to Pinal General Hospital in Florence, which is the prison town, Arizona State Prison, and began to work doing one 24-hour shift a week in the emergency room and then working in clinics. I got involved in delivering babies. I connected with a nurse midwife, and she and I took the county contract for delivering babies in this rural area for a year. And so I was delivering 10 plus babies a month and she doing as well. And so I love obstetrics, but enough 90-mile-an-hour drives into the hospital at 3 a.m. convinced me that was not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I really started to miss psychiatry. I was working with MDMA with patients at the time in my practice, enjoying that, but the FDA, DEA scheduled that in 1985, so that sort of broke that off. And then I just became really ready to go back and train in psychiatry. So I went back to Cooperstown, finished my adult psychiatry training, and while there, got interested in working with kids. So I decided I wanted to do a child psychiatry fellowship because I found it just so much more creative and flexible and fun, frankly. And looked around at programs. I had some friends in Albuquerque in that program, and they had a strong Jungian influence, one of the 2 psychiatry programs in the country that allowed Jungians to talk to their residents. And I went through a full dream analysis there, got involved in cross-cultural psychiatry. We got to go out to Indian reservations and deal with curanderos and listen to Navajo medicine men and go to various different ceremonies. It was really extraordinary. And then following that, started to look around the West. I knew we wanted to be in the West. We liked the East, but the sun just did not shine near enough for us. So we looked in Utah, we looked Arizona. We would have loved to stay in New Mexico, Santa Fe, but it was way expensive at the time. That's when Hollywood discovered Santa Fe and the prices had just gone through the roof.
Mm.
So we ended up relocating in northern Colorado. I got a job in Greeley at a pretty rural hospital. And I helped to set up their child adolescent psychiatry program. And really at that point, I knew how to practice conventional psychiatry and I knew how to practice holistic medicine, but I never really had any mentors or training in holistic psychiatry because they're really, I never knew of a person that was doing that.
I never heard of any.
So I got trained with Joe Helms in acupuncture, brought acupuncture into our psychiatric hospital. I was credentialed to do that in the early 90s. And you know, it's interesting in working in a rural area is the physicians there were less about philosophy and more about what seems reasonable. And when I presented acupuncture to them, they said, oh, that could be helpful here. And they allowed it in. Whereas I think in a lot of other places, there would have been much more controversy about it.
Yeah.
So I was, and then the medical director of the psychiatric hospital, it was a freestanding psych hospital, left soon after I arrived, and I got appointed medical director. And so I did that for a number of years, doing a lot of inpatient psychiatry, working with acupuncture. And I had an outpatient practice that was beginning to evolve in the direction of holistic psychiatry, slowly learning and applying more tools. And then about 5 years into that, a local CEO at a hospital asked if I wanted to set up a holistic medical center at the local 150, 200 bed hospital in Loveland, Colorado. And I said, wow, that sounds great. I'd love to do that. So I left inpatient practice. I set up a center for holistic medicine at McKee Hospital in Loveland in '99 and did that for about 7 or 8 years. I really enjoyed that. Working with medical staff was kind of a trip, kind of a new thing for me. But once again, you know, I'm pretty good at building bridges, and for the most part, the docs in the hospital were reasonable. I had strong support from the CEO, and we had an outpatient program as well as an inpatient program. We would do acupuncture in the hospital, massage, relaxation skills. We had yoga, naturopathic medicine classes for outpatient.
In a hospital.
In a hospital. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was really great. And at that time, I was working in residential treatment centers for severely abused children. And we were doing things with nutrition and dance and movement and breath work. The hardest part was changing their diet. You know, institutional cooking was a challenge because of the huge inertia, but we made some big changes. And I was working in 2 residential programs and then at the McKee Hospital. And then a couple things happened that really changed. We went through the recession in 2007 and 8, and the state shut down 12 of 14 residential treatment centers for children at the time, and just rationalized, and they're saving money, that these folks would be better off in a home setting. And really, these kids, for the most part, were so severe they couldn't be managed at home without being so medicated they were not functional. But these 2 programs shut down, and around that time, the CEO of the hospital left, and they brought in a new guy who was really antagonistic to alternative, holistic, integrative medicine. So I parted ways with him, left these programs, and said, you know, I really don't want to be at the whim of other people. So I set up my own clinic at that time. I gathered together 10 people that I'd known, various different paths, and we set up Wholeness Center, which was a comprehensive, integrative, multidisciplinary mental health clinic. And at our largest, probably 4 or 5 years ago, we had 5 psychiatrists, 3 therapists, neurofeedback, biofeedback. We were doing IV nutrition. And then about 5 years ago, we started to do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And then I heard that MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, was doing phase 2 work with MDMA in Boulder. I contacted a buddy of mine in Boulder who was doing this and said, "Are you kidding me? You're working with MDMA?" And he said, "Yeah, they're looking for sites." So I applied with MAPS. We became a phase 2 and then a phase 3 site. So now I'm a PI on the MDMA assisted psychotherapy for severe PTSD study that's about halfway through phase 3. And, knock on wood, if all goes well with that. And so far, I think it's looking quite positive. MDMA will be rescheduled probably in early 22. And we'll have this tool available to work with people again after 30 plus years of prohibition.
Mm.
So things are really changing. And probably about 7-8 years ago, I'd gotten the sense, I'd been involved in the American Holistic Medical Association. Rav Ivker got me involved in like 96. And then I became president in around 2000, 2001 of the American Holistic Medical Association. And loved that, really fully aligned with that. And then a group started to develop the ABIHM, the American Board of Integrative Holistic Medicine. So I got involved in that board after my term as president went off, and about 6-7 years later, I became president of the ABIHM. And at that point, I was negotiating with the University of Arizona, and we were talking about having some advanced certification for people that had been through a formal fellowship. And ultimately, we ended up linking with them. We ended up starting the American Board of Integrative Medicine, ABIM, and with Andrew Weil on the board, Victoria Mazy's, Torona Lowdog, a lot of other folks you're probably familiar with.
I interviewed Wendy last week and we talked about that. Yeah.
Beautiful. So right at that time, while I was president, we were negotiating. I was president of the ABIHM and also on the board of the ABIM, and was negotiating between our organization and the ABIM to create a path of eligibility for our diplomates, because we had close to 4,000 diplomates. So they would have a path to the certification in this new, more academic type board. So we accomplished that. I then ended up stepping off the board of the ABIM and became one of the founding board members of AIHM, American Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine, with Mimi and others, and sort of helped to get that launched, and stepped off that board probably 4 or 5 years ago. But somewhere around that time, I started to feel this real spiritual vacuum in my life and in my professional work. And the more I thought about it, it came down to spirit. And I felt like we had really used body, mind, spirit as our rallying cry, as our motto, as our sort of core belief, and that we had done a lot of good work around body and a lot of good work around mind, but I'd always felt like spirit was given second shrift. It was sort of the red-haired stepchild of holistic medicine. Mm-hmm. And, we give it some verbal recognition, but we really didn't have routine ways of assessing, treating, bringing this to bear. And that's what sort of brought me back around to psychedelic medicine again, because I realized for me what psychedelics were was it's an avenue to the spirit, and it's an avenue to express and honor and call forth the spirit. And I really saw that both as part of what I was missing in my own life and also professionally. So I began to get more involved in the world of psychedelic medicine, both in my practice working with ketamine, which I see as a close ally of the psychedelic tools. And it really allows you to work in the psychedelic manner. MDMA is just beautiful to work with, but it's a small trial and it's very restrictive. So until that's rescheduled, that's a small niche of my work, but it's a big part of my belief system. And now I'm really working to advocate for the spread of psychedelic medicine. I'm involved I've recently chaired a group with Compass, USONA, MAPS, Hefter, and CIIS, which are the 5 largest, most relevant players in the psychedelic medicine arena, either funders, research organizations, or training institutes. And we're trying to develop credentialing, and I'm trying to do some of the same things that we did with holistic integrative medicine, of making it a more professional space and trying to give better criteria and guidance and structure to the field. So I think we're moving towards a board of psychedelic medicine, which will be cross-disciplinary, including mental health therapists and psychiatrists, other physicians, a range of interests. And I've got to say, you know, in the, I don't know, 30 some years that I've been involved in, well, what is it? 42 years? 40, no. Well, since 1978, I've been involved in holistic medicine. And I've never, it's a long time.
Yeah.
I've never seen the amount of passion and intensity and fervor that I've seen with psychedelic medicine in terms of a healing path, in terms of this sort of renaissance and reconnection with psychedelic medicine as a tool for mental health and physical, and I think it's just sort of general well-being. So that is sort of my current focus day to day. I've got my clinic now, the Wholeness Center, and we're doing a lot of good things. We've published CBD research, done some clinical CBD research, and trying to do more. But about a year ago, I spun off a nonprofit called the Psychedelic Research and Training Institute to focus more on training professionals and doing psychedelic research. So we've just been funded by a large philanthropy group to set up a program in the business of psychedelic medicine to train practitioners how to open psychedelic clinics that may not have any business background. We've been doing programs in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy training, which is experiential for mental health professionals. And that's been somewhat derailed by the pandemic. But we're trying to figure out ways to bring that back online. And so I really see myself as I'm trying to be a catalyst to change the field of mental health. And that's really my goal. And I think integrative psychiatry has been a tool, but I think that psychedelic medicine may be even a more powerful catalyst to change our framework and begin to shift things. Because what I really see is that the paradigm that we have in psychiatry now is changing. It's outdated, it's unrealistic, it's not really, frankly, scientific. The biochemical, the serotonin model of depression is just a fading, outdated, unrealistic paradigm, and we need to move beyond that. We need to move beyond this sort of narrow neurochemical model, which increasingly psychiatrists are finding frustrating and difficult to work with. And I think young psychiatrists coming up see it for what it is. It's a failing paradigm. And the nature of paradigms, as you probably know, is that we don't really jump off a new paradigm until a viable one appears. We don't jump off our failing paradigm, even though the boat's on fire. We're not going to jump off it until there's a viable raft that we can get on. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, for all its beauty, integrative medicine, holistic medicine has not given us a robust enough mental health paradigm to deal with serious psychiatric illness. And I think it's given us a lot of humanity and humanism, and the holism itself is critical foundation. But I think without the sort of spiritual tool that psychedelic medicine brings to bear, we haven't had a viable model that will attract psychiatrists and cause them to jump ship. But I think now with psychedelic medicine, we finally have that new paradigm. And I think that new paradigm is us moving from a suppressive model of the psyche using antidepressants, antipsychotics, benzos, et cetera, to an evocative model where we honor the deeper content of the psyche and are using tools. Psychedelics become our microscope that allows us to see within that we've not really had before. And I'd say the other piece of that paradigm that I really the new paradigm is looking at quantitative EEGs and neurofeedback. I think those two things are sort of the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the coming paradigm in mental health. And so those are things that I work with all the time, I believe in deeply, and that's a lot of my work these days.
Say more about quantitative EEGs. I haven't heard that term.
Okay. It's also called a brain map. You may have heard that term. But basically, when someone gets a 19-lead EEG, they take an enormous amount of data in that can be using Fourier analysis and other methods, which can be broken down into a massive amount of data. You're probably most familiar with an analog EEG that our old school neurologists will page through looking for a seizure disorder. And they're looking for squiggly lines that means something bad's going on in the brain. They can, by the leads, they can localize it to some degree. But a QEEG is basically taking that 19 lead and using digital Fourier sophisticated analysis, which gives you a breakdown. They can actually create a, using tomography, they can create localization of the electrical source. They can look at power, they can look at frequency, they can look at, compare it to norms. You know, when you do a quantitative EEG, you typically get 20 pages of dense data that's looking at things like theta, alpha, beta waves that you may be familiar with. Mm-hmm. For example, we know that ADHD is sort of a wastebasket diagnosis, and that if you can have a child who's slowed, lethargic, daydreamy, who stares at the ceiling and doesn't like to move, and you can have another child who fidgets, jumps, runs, and is impulsive. And those two people, even though they're dramatically different and their brains are dramatically different and their needs clinically are dramatically different, those two people will both be diagnosed with ADHD. And they really share very little in common. And one of the things we know looking at brain quantitative EEGs in children and adults with attention deficit disorders, there's at least 6 different phenotypes that they represent electrically. And you can separate out a child with who has an inattentive ADHD from an impulsive hyperactive ADHD based on their quantitative EEG. And now the FDA has actually approved a device that will diagnose ADHD simply by looking at alpha waves in the frontal lobes. But I think that's really short shrift because that just identifies the most common variant, which is frontal slowing in ADHD. But I really believe now with the sophisticated tomography that we have and the sophisticated tools with Loretta on neurofeedback and EEG, you can now localize within 7 millimeters in the brain where the electrical activity is coming from. So using Loretta EEGs, you can now downtrain the amygdala. And there's no way that we can downtrain or approach the amygdala with neurochemistry. It's just not specific enough. It's not relevant enough. But with neurofeedback, quantitative EEG, we can downtrain the amygdala. We can train connectivity patterns. We can train localized sites in the brain. And, you know, we don't want to go on being the only specialty in medicine that doesn't really address its target organ. And I think right now, the evaluations we're doing in psychiatry are not too dissimilar than they were 100 or 120 years ago. And most psychiatrists that I know don't do blood work. They don't do any sophisticated biochemical assessments. They sit down and talk with a patient and utter their opinion about what's going on. And the reliability of psychiatric diagnosis is so poor that there's one of many reasons why psychiatry fails to gain much credibility in the medical world is because it's too phenomenological, it's too subjective.
Well, this brings up my interest back in the 90s when I read Continuum Concept and met Jim Prescott at an APA meeting, and realized that infant wellness was probably more important than any of the adult wellness I'd been doing. And then read Mary Ainsworth's work. I was actually in Charlottesville where she had just moved. I talked to her once on the phone, but didn't ever get a chance to meet her. And of course, Bowlby's work. Then we put together a group called the Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children, where about 13 of us in different areas interested in attachment. Suzanne Arms was one of the major figures. And we started looking at what were the ideal conditions for secure attachment. And we think that secure attachment percentages are in the low single digit figures, despite the 50% or so that the mainstream seems to accept. I don't know where you are on that, but.
Yeah, I think it is less common. You would hope more than single digits, but who knows?
So what are your thoughts on the American child rearing and birthing practices, given that you were on the front lines of that for a number of years? And
well, I wrote a couple books on parenting, Please Don't Label My Child, and Parenting the Whole Child. So I have a lot of thoughts on it. You know, first of all, in terms of the broad spectrum, I think what we're going to realize in an enlightened psychiatry 20 years from now, that the first 5 or 10 years of life predict the rest. Mm-hmm. In broad strokes. And that if we look at, for example, adverse childhood experiences, the ACE score, that's our best predictor of physical and mental health outcome in mid to late life. It matters more what your ACE score is and what your attachment history is than whether you smoke or exercise or what your cholesterol is. It's crucial. So I think that in the best of all worlds, you know, not only would we serve to try to support and promote attachment, but we'd also aggressively address adverse childhood experiences. And those things may actually be the same thing at its heart.
Well, the flip side of the same coin, yeah.
Yes, exactly. But I think, you know, if we were enlightened and wanting to save money in our healthcare system, we dump 30% of our healthcare funding on the first 2 or 3 years of life.
Yeah.
Provide support for moms and support for attachment and more home leave and more parental leave and all these kind of things that we need to do as a society. Otherwise, we're just trying to patch a leaky ship 40 years later.
Well, we're on the same page on that one.
I think we are.
How to get it across, though, like, my interest turned then to what happens to couples' relationships when you have kids in a nuclear family and how destructive that is, because there just aren't enough people to go around to meet everybody's needs. So I came up with a figure of 3.87 adults per infant to meet everybody's needs.
Well, it's interesting there. Bruce Perry, I remember, quoted some work looking at how in different cultures kids get different amounts of face time with their parents. Mm-hmm. And starting with an Aboriginal culture where it's almost 100%, and going down to modern inner city, you know, urban sort of upper middle class where it's, you know, in single digits of their daylight waking hours are spent with their parents. Mm-hmm. So yeah, face time, it's attachment, it's culture. And I think that's one of the positive things coming out of the pandemic is we've had this intense burst of family FaceTime, which is very stressful at parents, but I think it's been a wake-up call for a lot of people on a number of different levels. And it's going to be interesting to see how this creates a downstream influence on our culture and on these factors.
Mm. Well, another area that we overlap was back when I first separated from my first wife and went through that horrible experience of discovering what had happened to our relationship from having a child. Encountered Rich Jensen. I don't know if you know him. He had just, he was a graduate student with Lily and Helen Bonney and Stan Groff at Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. They just shut that down, but he was still there. So I worked with him and wound up doing ketamine sessions back in sort of been 74, 75. And
Wow.
that cracked my case. It was like,
Cracking the cosmic egg, so to speak.
exactly. And then fortunately, I was Joe Pierce's neighbor for a number of years in Virginia and got to spend a lot of time with him. And his cosmic egg that went on to a number of other books developing that idea. So,
Well, you've had a rich background.
yeah, I was very fortunate with those folks, and plan to interview Rich Jensen soon. He's up in BC now, and he and Donna.
Oh, I did a training with Richard and Donna probably 3 years ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know they were actively doing that. I knew they were keeping it somewhat alive, but
Yeah, they may have shifted gears somewhat lately, but yeah, we'll say hi to Richard and Donna when you
will
check.
do. Yeah. So yeah, there's it's exciting. What's on the horizon, and how do you think Big Pharma is going to react to all this if we not suddenly, but increasingly stop using all their wonder drugs that don't work?
Well, the nature of big systems like that is their inertia and their narrow belief. But it's clear that psychedelic medicine is not part of their business model, because our model is about transformative change with a few isolated, powerful events. It's not about daily suppression.
Mm-hmm.
And, to think about most of these medicines that are actually they're in common release, they're generic medicines. There's really no commercial model for them to market 3 doses of a psychedelic that are going to transform your life. They want something that's daily prescriptions where the dose slowly escalates over time. Mm-hmm. And people become dependent on it, and it's difficult to get off, like we have with antidepressants. We're now just realizing the full extent of the antidepressant withdrawal syndrome. And now we certainly have seen that with benzos. Half of people that go on benzos can't get off them. And the number may not be quite that high with antidepressants, but it's a strong part of the population that once they get on antidepressants, they're on indefinitely.
Hmm.
So I don't think there's a model for big pharma. And at this point, we're so small, we're sort of a fly on the elephant's ass, that I don't think they really care about us. And it's probably best that way.
Yeah, when they do catch on, what kind of backlash do you expect, and are you prepared for?
Well, I think what we'll have, the backlash, and we've seen it happen a little bit. The backlash when it occurs is thought leaders in psychiatry in academic settings, and the thought leaders are those that have more than 10 or 15 pharma companies on their conflict of interest form. And the thought leaders will come out and make pointed statements about the risks and troubles with this and its limitations. And, so once we start getting a fight from them, we know, and it's beginning to occur. In the last 5 years, there's not been any sign of it. But now we're beginning to get statements from the Charles Nemiroffs of the world, how ketamine can be a problem and a challenge and the risks associated with it.
What specifically are they saying about that?
Well, often the results are short-lived, and their model is typically giving people ketamine without any psychotherapy or without any interpersonal support or exploration. So they're really seeing it in a sort of a chemotherapy, chemopharmaceutical model, where it's, just the neuroreceptor changes, MDMA receptor changes. But I think the new paradigm is about how you use this as a tool to transform people. And so they're hesitant. And I'll tell you that one of the ways that I see this changing, the largest psychiatric event outside of the APA that goes on every year is Psych Congress, which is a CME event that gets 4,000 or 5,000 psychiatrists, and it's really focused on engaging clinicians in active practice as opposed to an academic event. And this year there's a full day pre-con on psychedelics that I'm involved in. Chuck Raison and others are involved. So if it happens in Nashville in September, it will be, I think, a watershed event where its psychedelics have pretty much hit mainstream at that point.
Wow. Yeah, and I hope it does happen or soon thereafter if they have to reschedule it.
So things are changing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've covered your professional history quite well. I want to go back to any other personal aspects. You mentioned you met your wife at your brother's wedding, and you got married. And do you have kids of your own?
We have two kids. My daughter, who's older, they were actually born on the same day, the day before my wife's birthday. She's an ICU nurse. Pardon?
But they're not twins, not the same year.
4 years apart.
Uh-huh. That's a good spacing.
That's a good spacing. Yeah, it worked well for us. But she's an ICU nurse at one of the Harvard hospitals in Boston, right in the middle of her peak with COVID now. So that has been pretty dramatic and stressful. But knock on wood, she's doing okay. My son is a journalist, writes for the New York Times Sunday Magazine, and is working on his own book. He lives in Brooklyn, another hot spot. He writes mostly about climate change, the West, and sports, because he was a D1 athlete, and track and field he knows quite well. So he writes some about sports, some about climate change. A wonderful author, and he's just gotten married. And we just had a puppy. We adopted a puppy a couple of weeks ago as part of our COVID mental health response. And Angus has been just a delight for us, a yellow lab who is cute as all get out.
Ah. So, well, can you say more about when your kids were younger and how that experience reflected your interest in child psychiatry? And
well, our approach to our kids was more nature, more outside time, a lot of social activity. We had a pretty vibrant, I think still do, a pretty vibrant community that the kids were part of. So they led very social lives, and we really encouraged them to have time with other families and have kids in our home as well. Most of the time we've lived out in a sort of a ranch or farm setting, where we do now. So we had an acreage with animals. At one point we had llamas, donkeys, chickens, horses, alpacas.
wow.
And we've trimmed that down a bit now, but I always felt like animals and nature. We would use our llamas to go hiking in the summer in the backcountry. Nothing I love more in terms of recharging my soul than being in the 10,000 foot range and doing mountaineering and climbing peaks and just being immersed in remote nature. So it's a part of my soul. And I think my kids are making noises that they're about to head back to Colorado. They've gone out to do their professional thing back east. But I think this pandemic has convinced them that their love of Colorado is real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So for us, it's I think child rearing is an experiment for everyone. And, luckily my wife is very talented mother and talented human being with a big heart. And I think made up for a lot of my inadequacies. And so it's, I joke with people that, I'm the child psychiatrist, but she's the real pro. No, we try to have fun. I mean, I think that's one of the elements that I really believe, and I learned growing up in a large Catholic family with 6 kids, is, you have fun, you get along, you help each other out, and you deal with the issues when they come up. But that's been my approach, and still is. We try to have an open door policy with friends and family and other kids, and still have active relationships with many of the friends that we met through our kids. We call them our surrogate children. Till our kids move back here and have grandkids, they're filling a void.
Uh-huh. Oh. It's been quite a trip. You're quite the Renaissance man. I enjoyed, I read some of your biography, but hearing it in the flesh and meeting you this way has been a true delight. Do you have any final words for future viewers down, who knows how far in time this video might survive?
Well, I think the important thing is to have passionate ideas, to follow your heart. And I just find that with my curiosity and my passion for making change, that I'm restless. And my wife jokes with me. She goes, now that, it seems like integrative medicine is fairly mainstream now. Psychedelic medicine is just about mainstream. She goes, what are you going to be into next?
Yeah.
So I don't know, but I stay active, I stay attentive, and I follow my heart. So that's my advice, and that's been my roadmap.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to wrap up the recording here. And thank you again for all of your wisdom and sharing, and appreciate it a lot.
My pleasure. Happy to be with you. And yeah, I think we're all in this for the betterment of ourselves and others, and we're on this ride together.
Okay, thank you.